Lieder sind Brüder der Revolution, Lieder sind ihre Begleiter.
I'm Hannah Judd.
I'm Sydney Hutchinson. This is Playing the Archive, a podcast of Second World music. Welcome to Playing the Archive. This is Sydney Hutchinson. Today we're here with our guest Sarah Fuchs from the Royal College of Music in London. Thanks for being with us here today in Berlin.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So Sarah and I go way back because we were both professors at Syracuse University some years ago, and we've both been lucky enough to end up in Europe, I think, in the current climate. I wanted to go back to start with some of the research you were doing back when we were working together, and then bring it up to date with some of your more recent work. And I think throughout your career, you've engaged with archives in different ways, which is perfect for our podcast. Like I say, we want to get to talking about your newest project, which has to do with deaf recordings made in Paris in the early 20th century. But before that, you were looking at how technologies impacted the world of French opera in the 19th century. So let's start there. What pulled you into that world of 19th century French opera?
I first got interested in French opera when I was a PhD student at the Eastman School of Music. There wasn't a lot of opera going on in upstate New York at the time, let alone a lot of French opera. So I mainly learned about it and became familiar with it through CDs, DVDs, even YouTube videos. And what really interested me as I started to read about French opera more is that they had their own technologies in the late 19th and early 20th century for engaging with opera at a distance as well. So things like the théâtrophone, which was a telephone listening service, or the gramophone, even early synchronized sound cinema. These were bringing opera outside of the opera house. And so this is ultimately what started to fascinate me, maybe even more than the works themselves in some instances.
Yeah, I think I was always struck when talking to you back then about how up to date it seemed, how they were engaging with opera using these new technologies.
Yeah, I think a lot of our current modes of music consumption can have roots in that moment in time.
Do you remember the band They Might Be Giants?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember, like, in the 90s, they had a dial-a-song service? You could dial up and hear a new song by them on the telephone. It makes me think dial an opera.
Well, that's effectively what the théâtrophone was in one of its iterations. So this technology started in the early 1880s, started to be demonstrated at exhibitions and fairs. But in the early 1890s, there was actually a company set up that would provide private subscription services to people who were wealthy enough to be able to afford it, or to hotels and restaurants and clubs that could install it for use by their patrons. And so you would pay a relatively small fee to listen for a few minutes, and you could choose what you wanted to listen to. If you were bored, you could move right on to something else, a different venue.
That's super interesting, like early jukebox.
Yeah, exactly.
And how do you think this kind of mass mediation compared to music consumption right now?
I think the real point of similarity is if you lose interest in something now, listening on Spotify or anything else, you can just move right on. You don't have to listen to the end. You don't have to stay to the end of the performance. And they could do the same kind of thing, then switch to a different dial, a different venue, or even dial the operator, say, connect me to a different venue. A really similar change in the attention economy in a way.
You mentioned this kind of innovation of having this dial-in music service. What other kinds of innovative uses did you notice of new technologies at the time?
One of my very favorite uses of technology at the time, and one that I think really was quite innovative, is this 1902 recording made by a singer turned Paris Conservatoire professor, Leon Melchizedek. So in 1902, he had already made quite a few sound recordings of excerpts that he was famous for performing on the stage. This particular recording, though, is not a straightforward performance, but actually a lesson that he is both teaching and receiving.
Non, monsieur Melchizedek de l'opéra, professeur au conservatoire. Prière de Guillaume VII. Attention, plan, allez. Sois immobile et vers la terre. Terre, allons, ouvrez la bouche. Terre.
So he plays the part of the professor and he says, okay, let's go. And then he sings a line from this excerpt and then he corrects himself. And so he's actually scripted in some errors for himself to correct. And then he moves through the aria in this way. There's two versions of it. And one of them is just incredibly fast because he's trying to fit so much in to this lesson to effectively give a consumer a sense of what he was like as a professor. The lesson itself is really fascinating because it has to do with French pronunciation and something that he had himself struggled with while a younger emerging artist. It raises all kinds of interesting questions about French national politics and how that intersected with identity around the time.
And this seems so similar to how we often learn music from YouTube today.
Yeah, it is, definitely.
And you're discussing how these technologies were mostly used by very wealthy people. Do you think the new technologies to make music more democratic, or do they reinforce old hierarchies? How do you see this question related to French opera?
That's a really good question. And things like the Théâtre-phone, the telephone listening service I was talking about, that really did both. So on the one hand, there's the subscription service where only the very wealthy could afford to have it installed in their homes. They'd have to pay a fee and another fee on top of a fee, and it was very elitist. However, when the same kind of subscription service was installed in other venues, public venues around Paris and elsewhere, other cities in France, I think it did have the possibility to be slightly more democratizing. For a small fee, you could listen to a small bit of a performance that you might not otherwise have access to. So it really could sometimes do both. Speaking about the phonograph, there were different models of these instruments available, from the very fine things that were effectively expensive pieces of furniture you would put in your home to something more basic, something more affordable. So there were different ways of approaching consuming music at a distance.
I think it really compares to the debate that we have right now about super technological platforms, but also accessibility to that knowledge. So I also think it relates to today's world in that matter.
What you just said made me think about the digital divides and how we say digitizing music, making it freely accessible on the internet makes it available to everyone, but it's only everyone who has a device has access. I'm not suggesting that technology may have helped to democratize access to opera. Definitely don't want to paint too rosy a picture here. It wasn't everyone who could access it, but perhaps more people.
In terms of how you were doing that research, what kinds of materials did you find in archives? Where did you find them? And then is opera itself a living archive?
I started my research in Paris in 2013, and I went to many different kinds of archives during that trip, and I've continued to go back to them through the years since. But what I found is that it's quite difficult to get access to sound recordings or other sonic artifacts from the time. Those are mostly kept under lock and key, sometimes literally for safekeeping. But there are other things that can help to fill in the picture. So the Théâtre-phone, for example, I found in the Archives Nationales an incredible map. It's basically now in tatters, but when you lay it all out and manage to put the puzzle pieces back together, it shows where the Théâtre-phone was installed, which venues and which lines connected it to which listening points across the city. So it gives you a physical sense of where people were listening and to what they were listening. I've also found that outside of the center, so outside of Paris, archives are sometimes, they'll allow you to access things slightly more freely. And so, for example, in the south of France, I discovered an archive devoted to one particular singer, Emma Calvé. And there they had discs, including some test recordings that seemed to have been part of her personal collection that had never been digitized. They have recently been digitized. But I was able to touch them and look at them and have a much more kind of intimate archival experience with them, just by virtue of it being a different kind of archival system. I think opera can often look like an archive. It's the same for the past 100 years or so. We've definitely been hearing the same canonic pieces put on the stage over and over, often to the exclusion of new pieces. But another way to think about it is also that opera becomes a kind of vessel, or specific operas, these canonic operas become a vessel for new techniques and new performance techniques, but also new production values. So maybe this is most obvious with the very cutting edge, often shocking productions that started to come out in the 30s and the 40s and have continued to some extent to this day. But you also see them becoming vessels for emerging performers as well, to kind of make a mark for themselves in comparison to the performers who have come before them, to establish themselves in a tradition, but also to do something a little bit different. So there's a kind of tension between opera's archive and opera's something that allows for a little something new to come through.
Mm-hmm. In that sense, you're talking about performance and how it shapes culture. If a performance has ever been recorded, do you think it becomes forgotten, and why?
That connects to what we were just talking about performers as carriers of tradition, the way that they embody the pedagogical lineage that their teachers have taught them. Some performers trace their lineage back to Liszt, or as a pianist, that's what I think of. But there's a way that this continues to be carried forward little by little. But it depends on performers as well as the traces, I think, that performers leave behind.
Also a form of living archive. So we can think about that as like a mycelial network, like a rhizome.
Yes.
Of different performances, different ways of approaching opera.
What that makes me think, though, is just how fragile it is. Because when someone who remembers something dies, where does that memory go? And this makes me think again about digital things. So many of the singers that I study have personal archives that are outside of Paris, in small archives. And the extent to which they are digitized or even referenced digitally in a way that anyone in the world could find out about is a little bit uneven. So even while I have been studying them, things that were on the internet have disappeared from the internet. And I am one of now the few people that know that an archive exists. What happens when I forget? These things, they have a way of living with people, performers or the people who carry on the traditions.
And we go back to the same question of materiality, this really utopian thing about a digital world that one day it's all going to disappear. It's really important to also think about the materiality of the object that we are storing. How to create new solutions for new archives in the 21st century.
We tend to forget, I think, that the digital is itself very material and it is just as prone, sometimes more prone to breaking down. And we need to provide for this in the ways that we are archiving and preserving.
I think it's even more quickly disappearing than many of the physical objects that we're used to working with in archives. But even within physical archives, we maybe don't often consider how much of the knowledge of it is actually in an archivist's memory and nowhere else.
We also need to address when the technologies become obsolete, because the people that carry that knowledge of that time, they know how to operate those machines. If those machines become obsolete, how can we access that knowledge?
Speaking of obsolete technologies, we're here in the Ethnological Museum of Berlin, the home of the Berlin Phonogram Archive, one of the best known and largest wax cylinder collections in the world. And now you're working with a pretty unique wax cylinder collection in Paris. Could you tell us more about this collection?
The collection consists of 228 wax cylinder recordings that were made at what was known at the time as the French National Deaf-Mute Institution. And I should clarify that this terminology, deaf-mute, is no longer used today. It was used at the time to refer to deaf people because if you couldn't hear, you couldn't speak. There's a lot going on in the collection. There are many, many different voices captured in the collection. But many of them are made by professors at the school and their students. They're deaf or partially hearing students. And they are part of a pedagogical tradition that's much contested then and remains much contested among the deaf community, known as oralism, through which deaf people were taught how to communicate orally through speech rather than through sign language. I first came across references to it on the online finding aid of the French National Library in 2020 during one of several lockdowns that I was living through in London at the time. I was first drawn to the recordings that claimed to have been made by French opera singers. And I thought, what could French opera singers possibly be doing at the French National Deaf-Mute Institution? Over the past 5 years, I've been working to try to figure this out, but the project has grown from there.
These are recordings of people learning to speak, and you're a musicologist. How do you approach these with a musicologist's brain and training?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So as I said, I first came to them through these references to French opera singers. And I was so curious that I actually did something I'd never done before. And I wrote to the curators at the French National Library. I said, I can't come to Paris. No one can come to Paris. Lockdown. Could you possibly send these to me? And they did, which, they will never do again. They have never done since. They will never do again. But I started listening to them, and it quickly became apparent that some of the material is something I would possibly know what to do with, operatic excerpts. Other materials, even in these recordings made by French opera singers, the materials are really unusual. So singers vocalizing, singers saying the vowel sounds or intoning the vowel sounds, even speaking. And so it made me think about a few different things. The musicality of the French language, and something that other people have studied but seems very relevant to my work as a musicologist, or is beginning to seem more relevant to my work. Also, just how much pronunciation mattered at the time when performing French opera. There's a real kind of overlap between these areas. As I've started to study other parts of the collection, I've started collaborating with other people in other disciplines to try to understand more about what's going on in these recordings, because it's clear there's so much in the collection that I couldn't possibly know all of it.
One possible reflection about things that you are discussing with us is that sometimes listening can be situated and subjective. How can we balance between this very specialized listening, the musical listening, the phonetic listening, with means of listening that are more effective and accessible as well?
That's a really good question. And it's one I've been thinking about a lot recently, in particular. In sound studies, which is one of the disciplines that I orientate myself, scholars are, over the past 10 years, starting to question what it means to be an expert listener, what it means for us as expert listeners to listen for other forms of expertise in the past. And scholars have been noticing more and more, it's a very simple point, but we tend to hear what we're listening for. We tend to assume that people in the past listened the way we listened. And so scholars have started to question this, and I have as well started to think, if I can't fully trust my expertise to know what I'm listening to in the past or what these materials are presenting to me. How could I listen in other ways? And if I want to listen sensitively to people in the past, for example, deaf children who are being made to become more fluent speakers, being taught to speak rather than to use a language like sign language that would be preferred by them. How do I attune my ears to what it might have meant to listen then? And so I'm really actively working through these questions now, but trying to find ways of listening more sensitively and in community, I think is an important aspect of that. As I've shared some of my work with members of other communities, including the successor of the French National Deaf Mute Institution, the National School for Deaf Children of Paris, they've brought in lots of new insights to the collection and what it means for the community, the deaf community in France today.
Exactly. So there's also a need to critically engage with the things that are voices, means of vocalization, sound. How can we, as academics, as artists, as professionals, how can we decide what is noise, what is meaning? What are the criteria that we can apply for a regime of legibility in some work?
The issue of legibility is a really tricky one. So over the past few months, I've had a grant that's allowed me to hire a research assistant, this fabulous PhD student from Cambridge, Apolline Gouzy, who is a singer, a musicologist, and also a native French speaker. And she has been making transcriptions of these 228 cylinders. So she would go into the library, she would have a listening session, she would make transcriptions. And when she came out, we would discuss what was coming up in the process of transcription and together work through some of these problems of precisely legibility and how to make a transcription which necessarily imposes a certain way of making sense of what is heard. And some decisions we've come to out of practicality. We wanted to be able to say, at least to each other in the short term, this person seems to be singing or humming or whistling or whispering. There's lots of different modes of expression. We've also tried to describe power relationships. So if we hear a professor and people following after the professor, sometimes that can be a student, but not always. There are instances where we've noticed that previous catalogers, for example, have misidentified these relationships. The person who goes first is not always the professor. The person who comes second is not always a student. And so we're actively questioning the ways that we're using to make sense of the recordings at every stage.
I'm really curious about the ethical implications of these recordings and how deaf communities today might relate to them, especially given the fact that oralism is still a huge debate and bone of contention in many deaf communities. Then you have the fact that these recordings preserve these voices in a mode that's not going to be accessible to many members of that community. Some people with assistive technologies might be able to listen to these recordings and others will not be able to. How do people in deaf communities today think about or relate to these recordings that preserve a really problematic policy with relation to their community?
This is a part of the project that I'm still developing in collaboration with the Deaf School in Paris. The conversations that we've had about these materials suggest that while they will be of great interest to some members of the community, that might be a relatively small number, and that we need to be really careful about things like where we would display them. If we were to put on an exhibition, for example, would it be appropriate to include sound from these? Quite possibly not. And not just because of accessibility, but also just because of the very painful history that it evokes for members of the deaf community. As you say, this is a live topic and it's something that's recognized by the deaf community worldwide. So in 2010, I think it was, the International Congress for Education of the Deaf issued an apology on behalf of the 1880 version of this Congress, which was where oralism first took root in a significant and internationally collaborative kind of way, for the harm that it had caused and the way that it had prevented deaf people from furthering their careers, fully engaging in society and so many other things for generations. To evoke that in any kind of uncomplicated way would be a huge problem. So it's something that we're really actively thinking about today as it relates to the kind of ethics of this project. The recordings themselves, which are now cared for by the French National Library, are set to be put up on Gallica as soon as they've finished making photographs of the cylinders and the boxes that the cylinders live in. And so what I think is really most urgent is that we contextualize these, if possible, in collaboration with members of the deaf community before they ever reach the public, in order for them to reach the public with a layer of context and explanation around them.
And yet, I think it's so interesting, the connection of deafness to recording technologies and their whole development to begin with. I wonder if you are making this connection in your work.
Yes. So there's a long history of, I think Maramels calls it the assistive pretext, that technologies are made ostensibly to help the deaf in one way or another. But as soon as their purpose has been achieved, the deaf are effectively left behind, and the technology continues to be developed in a commercial way or some other kind of way. This is an element of this project. But there is another. This particular lab was literally invested. They had technology for visualizing the voice. They had what was called a lyrégraphe transcripteur, a transcription device that would transcribe the wavy lines left in the wax cylinders onto a piece of paper so that members of the deaf community could see. If they could not hear, they could see the sounds that they had recorded and compare them to other descriptions and thus modulate their voices if they wish to.
Interesting.
Yeah. Possibly problematic in its own way for its kind of imposition of a certain mode of expression, but it's also accessible in another way.
Different sort of accessibility.
Exactly, yeah.
Can I coin a word here? The archiviness of your work. So you've described how these recordings were cataloged in a particular sort of way, and I wonder if you could comment on how you think about them or even how you are listening to them.
The cylinders are cataloged according to 4 main categories. They're technical tests, diction exercises, musical recordings, and spoken word recordings. And as you can probably already imagine, there's a lot of overlap between them, but you can't actually access a whole list of the cylinders in any way. I actually had to construct it myself. I'm just going in and putting them into an Excel spreadsheet. You access them via the catalog. You must go in to one of these 4 categories and find the recording that has been categorized for you. And that necessarily imposes a certain way of listening to it once you've got access to it. Once you find that recording, you have to write to your curator, set up a time to listen, go to the library, sit down at a listening desk and put the headphones on, and then you hear a spoken word recording. And so Apolline and I, she was making the transcriptions as we were listening together to them. We decided to move through them numerically in ascending order, as opposed to through the categories imposed by the cataloger, in order to try to hear the collection differently without these imposed categories, if we could.
There's so much to say about this project, and we could go on a lot longer about it, but we should probably cut to the chase and get to some of our wrap-up questions. I'm thinking about archives. When we're talking about early technology like the phonograph, how do the sounds we keep and archive shape how we think about history and how it sounded?
This question makes me think again about digitization and some of the things that we've already been touching on. Today, it's really rare to encounter analog sound recordings, whether it's wax cylinders like the ones I've been just talking about, or discs or tapes or anything in physical formats, in their original formats. We're sitting here surrounded by them, but this is still for me relatively rare. And quite a lot more often I'll encounter them at the French National Library. It is the first way you will encounter them. It's sometimes the only way you will encounter a sound recording through its digitization, its digital transfer. Of course, playing an analog sound recording requires, I don't have to tell you, it requires lots of physical intervention on the part of the person playing it back. It's not just you put it on, you play it back. There are things to adjust and ways that you intervene in making the sound the way you want it to. And then there's the whole question of digitization and how you intervene there, how the sound engineer might intervene there or not. But even things like what technology you use to capture it or what machine you play it back on, all of these things intervene in a way. What all of this has made me start to think about is the ways we engage with these sound recordings is heavily mediated by digital technologies. What we are accessing goes through several layers. Another way of answering this question would be to think again about sound studies, scholarship, and whether we, with our 21st century listening sensibilities, can ever be sure that what we're listening to from the past 100 years ago is the same kind of thing. Whether we've simply changed our conception of what it means to listen has changed so much in the meantime that we might have lost the ability to listen like they did.
Yeah. I think this especially when I listen to the wax cylinders that we have here in this collection. The quality is so bad. They're almost unlistenable. At least to me today. I don't know if they were listenable at the time, but to me today, I don't know. What am I supposed to be hearing in this? I'm hearing mostly noise.
What is noise? What is what we might think of as content or information? Was it even meant to be listened to in the first place, or was it meant to be visualized? Some of the recordings seem to have been so little played that they might have only ever been intended to be put through the visualization, the transcription machine, and then possibly shaved down and reused. So it raises all kinds of questions of if it was meant to be listened to and if it was meant to be listened to by me, which is connected to all of these ethical issues that we've been discussing as well.
Yeah, I think my question is a bit redundant, but it's a more personal question. Does this research change the way you think about sound, disability, archives?
I think I might have touched on this earlier, but as I have encountered this collection and repeatedly found myself not knowing why the recordings were made or what they were capturing or what was the point of this recording. Was it to capture a performance or an excerpt from a performance, or was it to diagnose a problem, or was it to test the machinery? It's really destabilized my confidence in my expertise as a listener. Is it noise? All of these questions are in front of you with every single cylinder. I think it fits in with this larger trend and that I've been talking about in sound studies of kind of rethinking our listening subject positions and also what we're listening out for in the past.
How do you balance what's in the archive with what's clearly missing?
It's a really, really good question. So for the singers that I've studied, one way of doing this is just to amass more and more different kinds of information about them, not just the standard stuff of scholarship like newspaper clippings, but postcards that I've bought off of eBay, for example, even by traveling to their hometowns and speaking with the people who curate their collections, their very personal collections today, and trying to understand more about how their legacy continues in places outside of official archives. This is one way I've been able to fill in some of the gaps in my own knowledge about them and the gaps of what's in the Paris archives in particular, which preserves only a certain kind of material. For this new project, I've been bringing some childhood experience to play. My mom is trained as a speech and hearing pathologist, and she would sometimes work with deaf and hard of hearing individuals in our home. And so I grew up surrounded by members of this community. For example, I learned how to communicate in American Sign Language. It was many, many years before I realized that that was out of the ordinary in any way. I just thought of it as another mode of communication. In a way, the scholarship is filling in some gaps in my understanding about my own personal history, but I'm also bringing it to my listening experience and my engagement with this new project.
Great. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for being here to do this with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
And thank you to Rita for joining in on the interviewing today. And a final thank you goes to Kiana Campbell, another intern whose voice we didn't hear, but who helped to write the questions for today. So thanks to all of you, and goodbye for now. Playing the Archive is part of the Second World Music Project, led by Dr. Sydney Hutchinson and housed at the Institute for Musicology and Media Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. The project is funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and the podcast is produced with the support of the Media Department of Berlin's Ethnological Museum and Museum for Asian Art. Co-host today was Rita Santos. That's all for now, but not forever. Thanks for joining us.